Good afternoon. We're going to call this meeting of the Spark Executive Committee to order. I'm David Toland, serving as chairman of this group. And for those who may be new to this meeting, either in person or online, I thought we might go ahead and just do quick introductions again of the members. So President Masterson.
I guess what else do you need to know besides Ty Masterson, Senator? So, District 16, down around Wichita, east side of there. So,
Thank you. Speaker Reichman.
Ron Reichman from Olathe, Kansas.
Mr. Pickert.
Hi, Bill Pickert from Wichita, Kansas.
Mr. Rolfe.
John Rolfe from Wichita, Kansas.
And Secretary Burns Wallace.
Secretary D'Angelo Burns Wallace, Secretary of Administration, Chief Information Technology Officer from Shawnee, Kansas.
Terrific, thank you. And Greg Orman, who is also a committee member, is tied up in traffic but en route, and so we hope to have him here very shortly. So I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Burns Wallace, who has follow-up from our last meeting, and so we'll just jump right in the interest of time and getting things done. So, Secretary?
Wonderful. Can we pull up the slides for me? And I believe all the members received a packet, or there is a printed one in front of you. So we are coming back together and just, we're starting, you could go forward for me. Talking about the 1.6 discretionary dollars that are, that the Spark Committee has the purview over. Can you go forward? And we did provide, after the last meeting, there were a few questions, if you all remember, if the committee remembers, that we did as follow-up. So we did provide those packets afterwards to try to answer a few of those questions or provide additional background information. Additionally, what we spent time doing in preparation to continue our conversation was to gather additional feedback from each of the executive members around the things that we discussed last time, including the guiding principles, the prioritized areas, as well as the structure and process. So we just want to spend a little bit of time today really in more of a discussion than presentation style comparative to last time, sharing across the group what we heard, what the Recovery Office heard, and also then presenting some modifications to the original proposed guidelines, priorities, and structure and process, really with the idea of making sure that as we start this process, this conversation, that we really do have an understanding of what the end goal looks like, because if we are identifying and have a common set of priorities, and we understand how we want to overlay the necessary principles on those priorities, it tells us when we know we're reaching that end goal, because we're working towards the investments in a certain type of way in those prioritized areas. So it's important that we start the conversation where we all have a common understanding of those guiding principles and those priorities. And then, of course, moving into structure to make sure that everything that we heard was taken into consideration around, having those stakeholder voices, having the opportunity both for those that can bring expertise externally, but also the members of exec to be a part of those conversations as then we make those ultimate decisions of where those pockets should lie. So we start with talking about the kind of principles, kind of the guiding principles. And you all have the packet. I'm not going to read through it, but just some of the highlights around really making sure that we're looking at the needs, that we're maximizing the funds, that we are being transformative in those efforts as we think about, and that there is, that we're being measurable, right? That there is an importance of understanding when we know that we're being successful, what those outcomes look like, what is the return on the dollars that we're having, but also keeping in mind one of the most important things, and we talked a little bit about this last time, is that idea of not creating a cliff. We want that investment that has long-term returns, but not has a tail on it that has to tie back into additional funding as this funding goes away. So if we go to the next slide, what we have here, and this is where, after I kind of walk through these, I would welcome kind of that discussion point, so talking around these principles, but really this idea around, again, prioritizing sustainable programs and investments, and particularly, and we heard this, I think, almost from every single member, around that local and state partnership and leveraging the dollars together to maximize the dollars for the state. Systemic impact as well as equitable opportunities as part of the conversation, and some flexibility. I mean, there's things that are unknown. There are things that we want to be able to say, this may be a priority area, but we may not know exactly how we want to leverage into that, but we know that we want to have some flexibility as things continue to change, both in terms of needs and the federal landscape, including future bills that are pending, but also, again, ensuring that the results are measurable, that we're tracking them on, are we actually filling the gaps? Are we addressing the needs? Do we know what the impacts are of the dollars that are coming into the communities and into the priority areas as we enter into those areas, but also as we continue to invest in those? So with that, I would stop and turn it back over to the chair, just to talk about other thoughts, ideas, or areas of interest as we think about the principles that we want to guide the areas that we eventually identify as those priority investment areas.
Thank you, Secretary. And I'd open it up to the committee for discussion, reactions. Mr. Pickard.
I would say, from my perspective, I'm very much in favor of the priorities as outlined. I think, as I said in my call with you all a few weeks ago, that I think this is really the right approach, and the idea of creating a long-term impact without creating a cliff is incredibly important, and having a lasting impact is really, I think, important for the committee and for these funds.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I think this reflects the conversation we had last meeting, and it's good to see them put in print. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, and the only comment I would make, I agree with I do still have some concern over the programs piece of this, right, as we look at how the spending goes, because it's easy to take a program and even maybe unintentionally expand it to a level that sustainability becomes a problem. So that'd be my only critique at all.
Mr. Orman.
You know, a couple of thoughts. One is when we talk about considering equitable opportunities, and in my mind, we should consider that on a number of dimensions, not the least of which is geographic. And so I think it's important for us when we're thinking about how these dollars are being spent, that the investments don't just benefit one part of the state at the expense of others. I also think that we're in a unique position here, and so when we talk about prioritizing sustainable programs and investments, I almost think we have an opportunity to do what I would call as sort of catalytic investments, you know, those things that are highly leverageable and ultimately are not necessarily an end to themselves, but something that serves as a catalyst for significant economic growth opportunities for Kansans, et cetera. And so I think we really should be looking for that as opposed to layering in more funds into existing programs or things that, you know, otherwise wouldn't be leverageable.
Thank you. Mr. Rolfe.
I'll get over here on the principles part.
Terrific.
I guess this is what I'd say, and I was going to bring it up later, but as we talk about long-term impact, I do think at some point it's going to be wise for us to say, hey, are there short-term needs this needs to look at, medium and long-term, and break down as priorities come out of the work groups and thinking about that, not just get stuck on long-term only. I just throw that out there. Hopefully they'll have long-term impacts, but I'm sure there's some shorter-term needs out there.
And I think that's an important point. One of the things that, you know, as we set the priority areas, it'll be important to even look at where investments were made in the last year and where some of those needs are, where other dollars are coming in. And there are and may be some short-term kind of priorities or areas that we need to try to address that help us build towards what we're actually going for, whether it's that long-term or, I love the idea of that catalyst investment. But there are some places where we're going to need to do some shorter-term investment for us to be truly positioned to be able to make those long-term sustainable moves and investments as well. So.
Terrific. Okay, let's keep moving.
All right, so now we're talking around the actual priority areas. And so this was, as we talked with each, what we tried to do was kind of pull out, last time we were talking really, really high level buckets. And so trying to really pull through some of those threads of priorities where we know that these are areas that we've had differing levels of investment over time. We know as we look at where the state is and where they want to go, we know we need these areas and these investments. And the reality, again, of trying to then put some level of parameters around where this work can start, right? And I think I want to point back to that idea of, in the principles of a little bit of flexibility, because I think if we can start with a set of priority areas that gives us a place to start, it doesn't mean that as the work gets done that there might not be some area else that may pop up or that may emerge as the research is happening, as the experts come to the table, as we do a little bit more analysis of where dollars are flowing and where their needs are. But starting with a common set of priorities at least gives us a frame to begin the conversations. So what you see here is a lot of what was heard from the group in terms of, economic growth and technical and vocational workforce. And some of this came both from the discussion we had last time, but also the individual follow-ups that we did with each member. And so if you go to the next slide. So again, thinking about kind of high-level buckets, but also areas or priorities within those, so that as we start to think about framing the conversation, ensuring that we have research, analysis, as well as expertise around the table to help us dive into some of the priority areas even within a particular bucket. So what we have here is just kind of showing some of the areas that we know based on the needs, based on assessment, based on just overall state priorities that we've bucketed. But then we also put stars where we heard probably what I would say almost all, if of the members also really highlight that. So it's not that you all didn't bring up some of the ones that don't have stars, but when we talk about where there was some emphasis put by the committee, these are the ones that really kind of came through kind of time and time again across conversation. You'll see one of the things, particularly like say in the bucket of behavioral health and early childhood, is this development of infrastructure. And that looks differently across those two different buckets, as you can imagine. But it was a theme that came through in different places and different pieces of the conversation, also in economic revitalization. I think it'll be important in places like that as those, if we move to that working group model, that we define what that looks like for that particular bucket and what type of how these dollars could be used, again, to invest in infrastructure that has long-term returns, but not necessarily that cliff that creates additional ongoing costs. And so there's definitely opportunity there. Other things, of course, housing and utility is one of those areas that came across very loudly as a need, as we're seeing that across our state in many different communities. Economic revitalization, I think this is probably a big piece for everyone around the table, from the workforce development and talent and recruitment, but also the infrastructure support, and a lot of work to be done in that space. The others I would just highlight also in, connectivity, broadband, the broadband infrastructure. And this bill has one component in it, which is the opportunity to, for the state to access the capital funds project to be dedicated to broadband. But with some of the new pending legislation, including the Jobs Act, there's potentially more dollars that could be coming to states around broadband as well. So it'll be important for us to understand that landscape and make sure we're positioning not just for now, but what also might be coming to be ready to leverage into it. And then in the government operations space, I will say that what we heard from a number of individuals is around that true investment in cybersecurity and IT modernization. Some of you may have seen that we just announced earlier this week a statewide task force on cybersecurity that we've been putting together for a while and was able to launch it. And so I think that there'll be a key partner as it has representation from state and local, public and private, and across various industries, can be a good key partner in doing some of this work and having some of those conversations.
And I might add, on the cybersecurity front, we have both the immediate needs within the public sector to ensure that we're secure from a cybersecurity perspective, but we also have private sector cybersecurity opportunities that are present right now that give us a chance to have that opportunity to leverage these investments that we make.
With that, I will stop. So again, this is, I will, kind of kick it back over, an opportunity to talk around, are we in the right place around our kind of the priority buckets? Are we emphasizing the right things? Is there something that's still missing across these areas?
Okay, thank you. Discussion, reactions from the committee. Mr. Orman.
Actually, one question first. You've mentioned a couple of cases and a couple of occasions a needs assessment. Was an actual needs assessment done that was sort of data-driven, or was this just a needs assessment done at the Office of Recovery that was more informal in nature? And if there is a needs assessment that was actually done with data, is that something that's available?
Sorry. So in different pockets, there are, what I would say in a couple of these areas, there have been needs assessments that are done in those priorities areas, not necessarily recovery office related, but in that sector. So in the broadband space, there's been work done over the last, I would say probably 8 to 12 months, where in that sector with work that was done out of the Office of Broadband, they have one, right? In the child care space, there's been some needs assessment done by an independent third party. So in each of these areas, there's some level. It's not necessarily recovery office driven in any way. And I think that's the type of, if we can build out the idea of working groups or however we approach that, where they could actually get some of that. This is coupled, though, with some of the dollars that have come in already with the relief efforts. What we have done in terms of that area of assessment is understanding where the first dollars flowed to and what impact or what it has funded, and where there were some pre-identified gaps based on those dollars. That's the only kind of, I would say, needs assessment work that's come directly out of recovery. Does that help?
Yeah, no, and I guess my point would be, it would be helpful to have access to those, because we can come to conclusions about what we think the needs are, but the reality is this should be somewhat more of a data-driven process, and my ideas on what the needs are may actually be wholly disconnected with what they actually are. So if to the extent work's been done, I'd love to be able to see it.
Yeah, I think a whole breakdown of round one of this, we're a continuation essentially of a Spark process, and what got addressed in round one, and to whatever degree we know how it went. I know we mentioned that in the last part. Again, this is a process question, so should I wait for section 3 before I launch into process? Because
I think it's an open discussion.
Yeah, what do you got?
I was going to wait, but it piggybacks off of Greg. I'm curious too, just, as if we're a Spark committee, if we think of ourselves as Team Spark, how much do we have a shared vision of Kansas right now as far as, and I know we got disparate political parties and a lot of times we disagree on solutions, but I'm wondering if we agree right now on the opportunities that are out there, you know, as far as what are the key stats, what are the key drivers for this state when we're looking forward, what are some of the things that we need to be trying to address? I mean, I think we've captured a lot of wonderful projects here on this page, but I'm wondering if there is some kind of level set for us as a committee, and if it's possible in this building and in this city, I don't know, I'm from Wichita, we can find agreement there. But as far as some kind of shared perspective on where is Kansas at, what data is important, and where are we headed? And you guys work together all the time. Maybe there's more of that than I'd know. I'm new to this. Does that make sense? Is that fair to ask?
So it sounds like what you're seeking is kind of clarity on a set of metrics by which we're going to evaluate where we are.
I mean, I'd call it a point of view that includes metrics. And so do we have a shared point of view as far as, you know, what's Kansas look like 10 years from now? If demographic trends continue, what are the key drivers that are going to help Kansas be successful? Do we have a shared definition of what a successful Kansas looks like 10, 15 years from now? I think just some discussion. We may disagree, but understanding where our points of view overlap, I think will help us move probably with more certainty as we go through this. And so that doesn't have to be this meeting, it could be the next meeting. But I'd find a lot of value on that from a process standpoint, because I think that'll help bring clarity to something that has so many bullet points. And I mean, we're talking about a whole state here, so it's got to be pretty comprehensive, right? So I just throw that out there for the committee as a possibility.
One thing to remember, and this is something that was in some of the background materials, and we can pull more of that background, is remembering at that very beginning of the different boxes and buckets. And so there are, as we think about this and have this larger conversation, also putting in context other federal dollars that are coming into other pockets. And so it's kind of I see it as kind of a two pieces. If you build that larger frame of like, you know, what does it look like? And then thinking about, okay, and then where do we want to leverage these dollars, given that there's dollars going into K-12 and higher ed, there's dollars going into health, there's dollars going into X, Y, and Z. And so also thinking about it as almost like a two-step. So then, because these dollars are discretionary and those dollars can't be used in other areas, they can only be used in the area that they are designated for, then how do we leverage these dollars into, you know, the gaps or the holes also? So it's kind of a two-step or twofold.
And John, to your point, I think one of the ways we can come up with a little bit more of a shared vision is by getting agreement on what the facts are. You know, that's the old saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think if we can get that, and as an example, I've just pulled some data, you know, when we talk about early childhood as an example, and it looks like, you know, we're starting to fall behind a little bit in fourth grade reading proficiency. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole set of data that compare us to where we've been, where we want to go, how we compare nationally around all of these issues that would be helpful to understand, because then we would get a much clearer view of where the shortcomings are, where the opportunities are, et cetera. And again, I'm saying this with all humility, recognizing that I could come up with a plan for how to spend all of this money, you know, tomorrow at my whiteboard in my office, but it's not going to be right. And it's not going to be right because it's not going to be grounded in all the facts we need to make smart decisions. So being able to get those needs assessments, I think, would be a really helpful grounding, particularly if this committee is going to be a real problem-solving and decision-making committee and not just something that rubber stamps things. So,
President Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just sparking thought there, right? Because, you know, I know for that money, our private sector appointees are, you know, you're used to a market where Ron and I are used to a building that struggles to find agreement, right, on sometimes even what is objectively true, right, or what we perceive to be objectively true. So I was just thinking about your comments, right? I mean, I think that's probably a good pursuit to try to find that collective goal as we move forward. Because, I mean, for instance, you see things like, One side might see more people on unemployment as a good thing because you have more people being serviced. The other side see more on unemployment as a bad thing because we have more people just unemployed. And what you do with those data points is a very different thing. And generally, the disconnect that I see potentially affecting us here, as just as I see through these priorities, right? There's certain things that pop to me, and I know there's certain things that pop to other people, are things like, in general, kind of the worldviews of how politics work. One side tends to see more government intervention as a good thing. The other side seems to see that as a bad thing. And so I can tell you right now, those are kind of the subsets in which we're going to run into some tensions, I think, as we move forward. So I think it probably is a laudable goal to actually get to the data and things that we can agree are objectively true and need to be dealt with from this perspective.
Mr. Pickert?
I agree with what's been said. I guess I'd like to see more clarity as to, we call these discretionary funds, but they're really not discretionary funds. They've got some prescribed uses, some things that can and can't be done with them. And I guess I'd like to see more explanation around, we've got a lot of things here on this potential list. Several of those things are covered by other buckets of money that have been provided through the ARPA program. And I don't, like you say, I'm not sure that there's something that we need to be spending these monies on specifically, but I do know there are specific limitations on where this money can be used and how it can be used. And I'm not sure that, half of these things fit necessarily within that definition. And so I think getting some better prescription as to what we can do with it would be helpful to the committee as well.
So a couple of things there. So we will refresh your original packet because we did provide some of that background around it. So the actual, which I believe the final rule is either out or coming out. The actual final rule is 150 some odd pages. And so we distill it down to kind of some buckets of what we know is fully not allowable and what is. What I will say is that what you see here in terms of this, most things that are here, and when I say most, I'm like in the general sense, they wouldn't be here if we hadn't already looked through and identified that they weren't. Last time we identified a few areas that we knew were not allowable because there is a lot of flexibility in this, in the way that you can couch it. It's that if you believe that, one, it has a nexus to COVID-19, two, that it is helping to impact economic recovery in relationship to recovering from. They're very broad. That gets into when you start to talk about real program design is where you see some of the minute details around what's eligible and what isn't. But in broad scope, this has a lot more room, I would say, in it. And so we can definitely provide both the full link to the 150 pages that I'm sure most don't want to read, but there are some also key pieces out there that have been produced by Treasury or other entities that kind of summarize it, that kind of give you an overview of how and what the funds can be used. The other thing that I would say, and I think this speaks to kind of the next section, I would encourage us to think about this in one way. One of the reasons that the proposal or the recommendation last time was to create working groups is that the reality of these areas, as you're saying, whether it's needs assessment, understanding what is going on, what these various priority areas needs additional voices around the table that bring some of that expertise and background to help us understand and fill those gaps. And so this group, as the executive committee, for me, really will have the true holistic picture to be able to see across and how the pieces come together, but then allowing and being a part of those work groups to bring, public and private and experts to the table that can really understand and help this group understand the data, understand where those needs are, understand what potential priorities that could be invested in it, and that the executive committee isn't separate from that, that we're a part of that as well, but that we're also bringing other voices that leverage into that expertise to help us understand what we're looking at when we look at a needs assessment, whether it's of childcare or broadband. So.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you. And I appreciate your words about the function of this group. And, you know, kind of want to jump a little bit ahead and kind of do what John did a little bit and open your slides as far as overall structure. I really believe this is an executive group. This is the board of directors. I do not want to see us become the board of the directed. And I think bureaucracy works that way, and you have the Office of Recovery set up, it's going to lend to that. And like I said before, we want to make sure we don't do kind of like we did last time. We have different parameters. We have a lot more time. There's a lot more flexibility. We have the experiences that we've grew from. And so I would like to see, you know, our board kind of have their own staff that can help guide this, direct this, work alongside the Office of Recovery, more for, you know, compliance, we're working along, but to have the ideas driven by this group and have it be reported to this group. What we're going to see is things that come out of the Office of Recovery that's fed to the governor's office that the governor agrees with and comes to us for a yes/no vote. That puts us in a lot of situations where we don't know what we're saying yes to, what we're saying no to. Like today's example, we're going to have a $22 million decision in front of us, in absence of what? Is that the number? But yet if we come out and say no, oh my gosh, this group of yahoos didn't fund the office and we can't answer phones. But we still don't have the data we need to make that type of decision. And so I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I want to kind of drive that discussion in that direction. That again, the budget that we didn't pass last time had about $17 million in it just for outside consulting for this. I know we can be more efficient with that and probably be more collaborative. And I think it's also going to save us a lot of time. Because if this board just has things come up and went, nope, not what we're looking for, no, we are gonna waste some time. We do have more time this time. You know, in fact, I believe Missouri is not doing any of this until next session. We have time. We think maybe 10 states are already starting to spend this money. Now, I think what John was saying, there's some probably immediate needs we should take care of. But the opportunity we have to grow this state, to protect the state, to invest is great. And I don't want it to be a bottom up. We're just picked with yes, no questions. I like to see the majority of those decisions come from us down or come from the folks that we've hired that report to this board and not to the second floor.
A couple of points, Mr. Speaker. So as it relates to the timing, I do think it's important that we have a thoughtful and deliberative process. But as you said, there are both immediate needs and immediate opportunities. And I want us to not drag out the process as it relates to those, while we're also on a parallel track working through the working groups to start from a place of data and to understand what the problems are, to get the perspectives of a variety of stakeholders that flow up to us as the executive committee. So from a process perspective, I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think we still can do that. I just want to have this group more involved with directing that process and have people that report to us and not to the second floor, then filters up to us. For example, I don't believe the request we had last time for 60-some million or request this time for 22 million would have made it this far if we had a little more say in balancing out where we want to see these funds being spent. For example, I'm jumping way ahead, the 22 million, all that can go to the unemployment trust fund if we don't spend it by the end of the year. That's what the last State Finance Council decided. I'm not saying that's the right solution, but you are saying no to something when you say yes to something. And we'll get in that discussion, the merits of that. I'm just using that as an example. Another example we don't want to see repeated is, it's just a small one, but the last set of funds was spent on the governor and Sharice Davids doing the PSAs across the state. This panel didn't approve that. The last panel didn't. There were provisions in the law that allowed for that, but I don't think the other three congressional candidates or congressmen were asked, or state or U.S. senators. And so those are type of things. Again, it's a small 150. I hate to say small. It's probably more than that now because I keep seeing it aired. But those aren't decisions I don't think this board would make. And it's consistent with where we're trying to go. The messaging, I think the majority of us want to see people with vaccines. We want it to be a personal choice and that kind of thing. And PSAs can be good. But again, that was a situation where The money was, we gave the authority to go do last time. This time we didn't. This time our law is very clear that the funds have to be approved by this board to be approved by the State Finance Council. It was both the budget bill and our subsequent, our bill after that. And so that couldn't happen again legally. But those are the examples of how I think if we're not careful, like we had 1.1 million. I'll repeat a little from last time. It's just turn around. What did we get for it? To Greg's point, what are the measurables for that? I think I heard Bill say it as well. What are we getting for that return? We have the time to do that, and I think we actually be more accountable if we had folks that reported to us.
Mr. Orman?
You know, if we're on the subject of process, I guess a couple of thoughts. I would applaud the Office of Recovery for the efforts at outreach last week. I think that was terrific. I think it was done in good faith. I think it ultimately ended up incorporating a lot of additional feedback from this group that was positive. And so I would say that was a very positive step in my mind towards building goodwill, trust, et cetera. As it relates to process, I do think one of the things that seems to be unaddressed, in addition to what Speaker Reichman said, is how we want to distribute the dollars in terms of when. And what I'm thinking of specifically to Speaker Reichman's comment about when we say yes to something, we're saying no to something else, I think it would make sense to think about this spending in phases. And maybe there's an immediate needs phase, you know, the things that have to get done right away. Maybe there's some phase one spending where we go through a process of working with working groups, with stakeholders, with state and local, or local and county officials, and ultimately come up with this group of potential projects or opportunities to invest. But then we make a decision at a point in time so that we are trading off those things against each other, and then potentially a phase two spending. So, and I know the federal government has appropriated the money sort of in that way. They've given us so much right now, and they're going to give us so much next year, and was it next year or the next fiscal year? And so I think maybe if we also came to an agreement on phases, we could again say there's an immediate needs phase, things that have to be addressed right now. They're critical to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. And then there's phase one spending, phase two spending, and you might even reserve a little bit of money for what you would consider to be follow-on spending. So as I looked at what you put together, you know, one of the things that I think is missing is this idea of how we are going to spend the money. And I think that's also important for the public to be able to give them a sense of here's how the money is going to be spent, when it's going to be spent. So if you have a need, you know, you're a wastewater district and you decide that there's some spending that you need to do and you want to be considered as part of the Spark process, you know that that information has to get in by a date certain and that the decisions are going to be made on a date certain. In my mind, it's something similar to what states do with historical tax credit allocations, et cetera. There's a known understood process so that people don't feel like these decisions are either being made one at a time and they can never get in line, or alternatively in some sort of opaque process where they don't know how and when the money is being spent. So that's another sort of thing that I would suggest we need to think about in terms of process. And I guess as a corollary to that, I think there should be a way to get something before this body that doesn't necessarily flow from here or from a working group, i.e. if a county has something that they want us to consider, I think there should be a way for the county to be able to say, look, I'd like you to consider this as part of the Spark process. Now, that doesn't mean we wouldn't assign it to a working group to make sure it gets vetted and we run through the data on it so that we're not working with bad facts or someone else's facts that are just intended to sell a story. But I do think there needs to be some view for how other stakeholders can get potential investments in front of this body. So again, there's a perception and the reality of this being an open, transparent process where we're going to use facts, you know, common sense and good decision making to figure out how to invest these dollars on behalf of the people of Kansas.
Can I add?
Madam Secretary.
So a couple things. So one, I do want to point back to one thing. And so Speaker Reichman, the example that you gave, for instance, in terms of the PSAs, that is a perfect example of what I was talking about those various other buckets. Those, for instance, were paid for by FEMA dollars that are tagged for vaccine communication that come in through FEMA to KDHE that can be used and tapped by the state for no other purpose than vaccine communication. Now, again, what was used or what the communication was or who was in it, that's all debatable. But I use that just solely as an example of, as we start to understand these dollars, helping to paint a larger picture of understanding what are all the other dollars that are flowing in that might have different levels of restrictions. So as we prioritize, we can say, well, if that's in that column, we may want to have a conversation about that, but then we can leverage into a different column. So that's just one example of, it will be important contextually so that we see what is in some of those other boxes or what other funding, because that wouldn't have come through either the previous process or this one because of the way in what those dollars were tagged for from a federal perspective. So that's just one piece of this, of making sure, and that's why I say, we'll have to continue to gather information and try to provide that background information in those various pieces so that it's all continuing to be holistic and within context for all of these conversations. The other piece that I would just add, and then I will turn it back over, is I wholeheartedly agree around the idea of there being process and needing, and that's why I speak to this idea of a holistic, right? That no, you don't want to make one-off decisions at times, but also thinking about how do we come to a space of creating what are some of those parameters or priorities so that as we begin to make those, that what you're trading off against, right? And so that's where it goes back to maybe that, again, starting with that common vision or that common space of understanding these are some of the areas that we want to prioritize out the gate. And then we do the work to understand where those needs are there. And then we follow on with that likewise.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you. I do want to follow up on the example that you reshared. My understanding that was funds left from the last tranche of money, the one that was last fiscal year, not this new that we're talking about today. So this was a new money that just came in there in this year.
This is FEMA dollars.
Right.
The FEMA dollars that were accessed and triggered, and there's a whole set of FEMA dollars that a state can access for testing and for vaccines, and they're under certain categories, and then you have to apply and trigger for those particular categories. So it wouldn't have, any of those FEMA-related dollars never went through the last CRF or Spark process because we access FEMA dollars all the time for what they're designated for.
Right. And this year, the bill that was passed and signed had a very clear provision that any COVID-related funds would go through this process. And so if it was last time, there's some area that we gave some agreement, or gave a policy back to state, the Finance Council passed to give some flexibility. This body hasn't done that yet. And so it was pretty clear, not just the budget bill that was passed, but the follow-up budget bill that passed that stated that the COVID-related money would go through this process.
We'll get some clarity on precisely where that came from and the adherence to what was passed.
It's probably as important going forward that we do understand that this board does approve the COVID-related federal money. Obviously, this other discussion is great. I don't want to derail it too much because I think we have to get our structure down. But before we go too far, we need to determine, and some of this again is just our last two budget bills and the sections we have them that we can provide.
And I want to make sure I want to respect the conversation here, but I also want to keep us moving on this particular slide and making sure that we've got the right topical areas and that the sub-bullets have been appropriately emphasized. Mr. Rolfe?
Mine was more on the conversation you're trying to move on from, so I can come back to it when we get to the next part.
So other reactions, Mr. Orman.
The only other thing I would say here, and I know that you have made a couple of mentions of this already, but when I see things on here like supporting infrastructure, especially water and sewer, you know, I do believe that that is also part of the federal titles that are being considered right now. So I think just, again, being conscious of the fact that there may be other dollars coming in some of these areas may also guide us as to where we're spending our money.
That tracking will be important, and the viability of it. So we've been tracking on it throughout in terms of what's the possibilities, and as it gets closer, we pull it in. But I think that that then speaks to, again, this holistic picture of if we get to a point where we're at whatever phase and we're like, we think we're ready to make a move into this space and let's say leverage into, a major water and sewer investment. The one thing that it is, that we have seen so far is that, let's say we did that and we invested, 30 million into a particular project. If an additional bill comes through and that then becomes eligible under that bill, we typically have seen, per the guidance, we are able to swap that. So you could then take that from the new bill and you would basically, from a budgeting standpoint, use those new dollars, and then that would put, say, that 30 million back into the table for consideration as a whole. So that's why this is that piece in the principles when we're talking about flexibility, like us being just agile enough that if we can set the priorities of where we want to be and what that looks like, being able to leverage across dollars, both federal dollars, but also being able to leverage, speaking to your other point, across state and local dollars. Like if we can identify in some of these places, is there then that opportunity to reach out and say what counties or what cities might be doing X, Y, and Z, and because we both identified this as a priority, are there now opportunities for us to come together in those spaces to leverage, to maximize the dollars across both?
And I think, the goal in front of us, what we need to achieve is clarity around what it is we want these working groups to dig in on. And that's what we have in front of us here. So these broad categories of essential needs, economic revitalization, and so forth. Do we have at least a reasonable level of comfort around these areas? Now, I'm not talking about how, I'm not talking about when, but talking about what. Are we comfortable with these as a committee so that we can give some level of direction to these working groups? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Kind of the three things that I talked about last time, like grabbed, what are the immediate COVID-related needs, what's the economic growth, and how do we offset future state spending? I'm not sure how much of that's picked up in here. We all heard the great news about, the $2 billion in reserves we have. The profiles we're getting continue to run with normal receipts. 2024, we're back negative. And so it goes pretty quickly. And so what can we do? We'll make sure that's one of our main objectives. In addition, a little more here, but then that's a great place to start.
Thank you. Mr. Orman?
Yeah, and I would say obviously it's all got to be viewed through the lens of what's the ultimate goal, which I think the speaker just outlined, those three goals of mitigating pandemic-related issues, economic growth and opportunity, and ultimately mitigating any impact on the state general fund. But within the context of that and recognizing that not each of these are going to be ultimately invested in at the same level, but I think broadly speaking, these are a fine place to start. And to your point, to the extent we get into it and decide that there is another critical need that hasn't been addressed, we can course correct. So I think this is a sort of a fine set of things to start with, recognizing they're not all ultimately going to be equal depending on what we come up with, and we may be doing some course correcting.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for my own clarity, are you suggesting, for example, that the essential need, the economic revitalization, behavior, those be working group categories? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes.
And it may be to think about if we can, at least, so like with economic revitalization, behavioral health, early child development, right? To kick off some conversations, and then maybe this group is asking a set of questions into that group to help inform and shape, like, okay, what is the needs in this space and how could this look? And if there was short-term and long-term needs in this space, what would that look like? To be able to help kind of frame the foundation of the conversation. No decisions, no, not saying like, we want this project, we want this or whatever, but that we use them initially to help give that perspective and that frame. And then additionally, again, fill in some of the other pieces about, understanding how the dollars can be needed, can be spent, understanding what the other dollars that are out there that could also play into these communities. But even kicking off some conversations with some more voices in a couple of these concentrated areas to bring more of that foundation of what is going on in that area and what's possible and where the needs are, from the needs assessment, from the data, both short-term, mid-term, and long-term, to begin to see, yes, this is an area we want to invest in, without even trying to tag it for like we're trying to put X number of dollars into it immediately, but say, yes, we are almost confirming, yeah, this is that priority area because we can see what the needs are and where we could take this. Then that gives this committee the opportunity to see multiple of those buckets together to then begin to refine where we might want to leverage into those priorities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think what I'm feeling is, I don't think I'm ready at this meeting to say these are the 6 work groups, but I would like to see us, and not to slow us down any, but probably at our next one, actually see proposals of this be the work group, this be how it's made up, these are the directives. I like, with the directives of subcategories, I like the idea of kind of immediate first phase funding, second wave funding, and some potential cleanup in the end, and actually debate a real proposal about this is what we propose they be, this is how we propose the makeup, these we propose to be the directives for this particular work group with all these considerations in mind.
Just point of clarity, so what are we lacking in terms of data on this? So, for example, we've got essential needs, you have housing as an area that we've heard from multiple folks on the committee that's a priority. Now, housing, what does that mean? It can mean multiple things. That could be about new housing construction, it could be about rental assistance, it could be about a number of things. Do you want to take it down to a more granular level, or do you want to leave that to the work groups to dig into housing generally?
No, I don't think necessarily anything's missing necessarily. I'm just sitting there as I evaluate this. I mean, the categories are okay, but I think I might combine these differently, and I'd like to see us maybe have an actual proposal on the work group, and this work group's going to take housing and transportation. This one's going to take early childhood development and behavioral health, and this group, and this is how many people will make it up, and this is how we will structure it, that kind of a specificity. I'd like to have us debate the actual proposal of those work groups.
Secretary?
And can I ask, as that information is put together, would members be comfortable, kind of like we did this time, of us being able to gather some of that information so that it's reflective of what we know and then what other ideas are, might be out there, particularly because, as you mentioned, and I like the idea of like each group having clear directives, and so that we're capturing appropriately what some of those directives might be, understanding it might morph and that there's a larger conversation. And as we also gather names in relationship to who might be experts, that would be important to have, broad perspectives in some of those conversations. So.
Yeah, and even look at some of the potentials following some of the speakers' remarks of who might be able to assist us as the directors in and how that structures. I guess all I'm saying is I'm okay with the broad categories. I'd like to have a debate, probably the next meeting, about exactly what that may look like with specific proposals.
Speaker?
Yeah, I think the phone calls are helpful. It was good to get a chance to see a lot of things we talked about reflected in this presentation. I think for me, still the point is who's driving it? Is it our executive group, that team that we hire, or is it the administration and the recovery office is going to drive that. That's probably a sticking point for me. That decision hopefully can be made, which direction we're going there.
Just as a point of clarity, so are you proposing that the Spark Executive Committee hire a professional staff that would be in addition to the recovery office staff?
Yes. That would report to us, and that could take the ideas that we have, along with their own ideas, and help direct it. The recovery office would still be there for compliance and gathering information and helping, but the majority of the ideas will flow through this group or the folks that answer directly to us.
The only thing I would caution there is to please understand that this is not a singular piece, that everything that is happening as a part of this conversation and the other pieces are so heavily intertwined with everything that happened before the two previous bills, the existing bill. And so as someone who has sat intimately in this space with all of these for the last year, year and a half, it is not an easy space to navigate, and we have tried to work very hard to be able to, all throughout this past year, deliver every piece of information that is asked in and around what we have available to us. And so I would encourage, if it is all possible, if there is a different way this committee wants to have material delivered, if there are specific questions that they need outlined, the only reason I caution around it is because there are just pieces of it that they don't sit singularly in their space. And what we have tried to build is a set of expertise that is helping to bring the state the biggest perspective of when you move that cog, it actually impacts 15 others over here. And we feel like it is well put together to answer those questions. And so if the space isn't being a response or isn't delivering to this committee what it needs, would welcome the opportunity to be able to address that before we stand up something different that has to have a set of background that I think could slow down the work that you all are trying to do.
I'll just reiterate, we're not under the time constraints that we once were. There's other states that haven't touched this yet. A term I heard recently was patient capital. I think this applies here. And I'm confident we can find folks that are intelligent enough to figure this out. And maybe it's folks that are already inside the recovery office that kind of move over. I think we're open to all that. But I want to see the ideas driven from us and not the other way around. And I sense that that's happened before, since it's already happening again. And we'll be presented with options that are really, and not knowing what we're leaving on the table.
It's my expectation as chair that not happen, and that the team, the professional consulting team, and the staff, while I realize that there's the org chart and how the boxes are arranged there, and I realize we have executive branch and legislative branch members, we've got different parties here, but it is my expectation that the folks that are working on this are working for the committee as a whole, and that they are providing the same information to you and to me and to all of us at the same time and in the same way, so that we can have an honest and fair and transparent process. If we get to a point where that isn't happening, I think this is a different conversation, but I'm not sure that we need to set up a duplicative layer of staff support at all.
Well, I think it goes to who they report to. I mean, who does the Office of Recovery report to? Secretary. Who does the secretary report to? Second floor, then to this board. We're talking about a layer that answers directly to this board and the folks that we have a say in who's hired. The responsibility we're given is great. And it's not, for me, we have, actually look around this room, who's sitting at the table, and the people we have access to, it could be a pretty phenomenal result. And we'll take today's ask when we get to them. What are we saying no to on the 22 million? Have we gotten the full information of what the last tranche of 30 million was spent on in call centers? our committees have asked for repeatedly, and I think today we're finally going to find out. You know, if we have folks that are actually helping make the decision, drive it, I think that's the way to go. I think that's what our citizens demand. I think that's what we end up accomplishing, those four or five main objectives we want to accomplish. And we look back and say, you know, we had a big part of that, and we're the ones that are responsible for it, and we didn't just have things come up that we had to say yes or no to.
Mr. Rolfe?
Let me add another layer of complexity to this conversation while we're at it. This is what I was going to bring up earlier. So as far as we think about time horizons and as this committee moves, again, not being a guy who's in this building regularly, what's the reality of how this committee moves and acts once the legislature is back in session? And knowing that next year is an election year, you guys who are in this full time, looking at the three state leaders up here, how's that impact a group like this? And how do you see it impacting our process? My assumption is it's going to make things more complicated. I mean, one, just because you guys' time and attention is going to be 1,000 different places, the demands you have. How do we need to be thinking about the work we need to get done between now and the legislative session and an election year versus what we can actually achieve during all that noise? And knowing that there's possibility of rotation on this board and all that, so do we need to think about governance of this board and how that works? So I'll throw it out there. I know it's kind of a tough discussion, but you can educate me a little bit here. Thank you.
Mr. President?
Well, certainly when the legislature returns, it adds complexity just because you're adding, 160 more people back in. But complex isn't not necessarily worse, right? I mean, so there's value in having all those voices participate. I mean, that's why we have the system we have. And that's why LCC really only functions outside of session, which is kind of the coordinating council, which is made up of the leadership. But I think there's a reasonable expectation from a timeline, particularly if we go into phasing some initial, kind of that first wave funding, to have that accomplished at a minimum by this body before the end of the calendar year, to where that can be all instituted. But then there's some value in having that second layer evaluated to a large degree by the legislature as a whole, the people's representatives. So, I mean, it does add a complexity without a doubt. But I think we can have reasonable expectations to even structure in a way we can move, I think, reasonably quickly on this, particularly that first phase stuff. I think that is a reasonable expectation, even with the legislature. Now, I'm not going to pretend that election years don't make a difference, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, we're already there. Right? Yeah, featured advertisement, exhibit number 1. So,
I might just bring it back to, from my commerce perspective, I see right now we've got one of the hottest economies in the country, in the state of Kansas. That brings with it opportunities to do more and to build on the momentum that we have, but it also brings some immediate needs, whether we're talking about workforce and the need to have workers to fill the jobs that have been created, or whether it's about housing, because we know we've got an acute housing shortage in the state right now, whether it's about early childhood and the fact that you've got to have childcare access in order to support the business growth that we have going on. I say those to say that I think timing matters, and there's a certain amount of urgency around getting clarity on what we're going to do and on what time frames and how it'll get done in the next 3, 4, 5 months. And so it doesn't mean that everything is determined all the way out, but we do need to give the public, I think we have an obligation to the public, to give them some direction, particularly at the city and county level, where they have their own ARPA dollars that they're trying to figure out how to invest, and in many cases, they're looking to the state for guidance. And so we don't want to leave them hanging, we don't want to miss opportunities, and we've got to address, particularly these urgent needs and urgent opportunities. Mr. Orman?
John, part of the reason I thought about thinking of this in phases and having very clear goals for how much gets allocated at each phase, assuming that we find investments that we can make that meet our goals and objectives, is because it sort of takes that layer of politics out of it to the extent it can. You know, we have a clearly identified goal that we want to spend X number of dollars, invest X number of dollars by a date certain, and that sort of gives us a forcing mechanism. When we're asking people to bring forth proposals, we're asking working groups to get their work done, and I think we could have very clear deadlines that, you know, for the first, you know, the emergency phase might have to be spent in the next 60 to 90 days, and then the first major phase might be, you know, the first quarter of next year. I mean, you could have some very clear goals that would help sort of address those issues. I also think, though, that may be a reason, you know, as the Speaker and Lieutenant Governor have had a bit of a back and forth as it relates to where the staff resides. You know, if we do create a scenario where the Spark Committee, by and large, feels like it's being dictated to, I think that slows the process down. And so, you know, I think that's one of the important things. While it may take a little longer to do what Speaker Reichman proposed, my suspicion is it accelerates decision-making in the future, and so those are trade-offs. And I don't really look at that as duplicative, in the sense that if we consider the budget request that was made by the Office of Recovery last go-around, it's clear that they plan to add considerable resources, which I don't think they would consider to be duplicative resources. And so as long as the work can be parsed and managed in such a way, I don't think what you're talking about here, Speaker, is duplicative. And, you know, certainly in the context of the significant increase in consulting budget that we saw in the last budget that was presented. But that's, you know, that's just yet another reason to consider the process and make sure we've got the process defined right up front, because if we get to that first spending phase and there's broad disagreement, that's going to be a failure of this committee.
Let's do this. I'm hearing that there's a desire for some more specificity around the work groups. President Masterson's requested a proposal on how these would be structured that provides some more detail. So we will come back the next meeting with a proposal. I would like the Recovery Office staff and consultants to interview and reach out to each of the members of the committee to talk about what their expectations are related to that, so that we've got a proposal that is well-formed, that reflects the perspectives of everybody on here. And if there are still disagreements, we can hash it out in the committee, but we need to come back with that. So let's start there. I want to keep us moving, just in the interest of time, to get through all of this. I think we need to have more data and really, as part of these conversations, include the discussion about staffing. And so we'll bring that back to a future meeting and figure out where we are in there. But I want to make sure we're clear on what the problem is we're solving. And I'm not seeing the problem at this time. And so let us gather some more data. We'll be back with that. Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might be tasking people something they may not want, but one thought would be, because our private sector members are a minority of this group. There's 3 of them, there's 4 of us from the public sector. And maybe we could task the 3 of them with a structure proposal as well. So we'll have some potential competitive proposals to deal with, but we'd actually be looking at developed structure, and to the best of them, and the best you can't remove politics entirely, but to the best degree you could, I might suggest, if they were amenable, that our 3 private sector have conversations and potentially come up with a structured proposal as well, because they're the furthest removed from politics of this group.
I'm going to put my Secretary of Commerce hat back on. So I'm always working to find ways that government can work at the speed of business, and that we're reflecting, private sector approaches to getting things done. I would stress in this particular case that what we're talking about is a highly complex federal bill that has a lot of layers, and there's a lot of very detailed expertise.
So for clarity.
Yes, sir.
I'm hearing something that I maybe said that was heard differently. I'm just talking about the general structure. These are the work groups, these are how it would be structured.
okay.
Relying on the Office of Recovery for compliance and those things like the speaker mentioned. I'm just talking about a more simplified processing structure. What is first phase, that type of thing, not removing completely and tasking them with a task equal to what the recovery office is doing. More of just for our purposes, kind of a structure proposal.
Mr. Pickert?
I'd like to ask the question of the Secretary in terms of the consulting services and the arrangements. And I understand under your office, the Office of Recovery is a wide variety of stuff under the ARPA legislation. You've got a lot of things under your purview there. The consulting services, they're looking at all of the buckets and working with all of the groups. I was wondering, do you think there's a way to carve out that consulting relationship as it relates to the Spark funds, to, again, just to have a direct voice to this committee from the consultants as opposed to, through a staff, process? And I was wondering, do you think there's any way to do that under the current structure?
I think there could be. I think that, so what I will say is that right now, every piece of it is intertwined in the sense of any individual is not working on one solo thing. So as much as, we're maybe working on Spark or ARPA, we're also working with the state agencies and the dollars that are coming through. But because of the resources that we've leveraged specifically into to Spark and the discretionary dollars to be able to, and I think Speaker Reitman mentioned this, peel off a few staff and have them dedicated just to Spark. I think that could be done. We could look at what that might look like. Again, I think we still need to get a little bit more feedback to make sure we're understanding, what some of those expectations are, or kind of that flow of information. And so, yes, I think that there could be some potential there, and that's something that we could look at.
In terms of the consultants working directly
Correct.
with the Spark Committee?
Yes. The funding is the same, so yes.
Mr. Speaker?
I think that kind of goes to the point of us wanting to have our own, who hires that consultant firm and who vets them. And, I think, again, it all comes back to if you trust the process, you'll trust the results. And I think the more this group's involved, and if we have direct hires that report directly to us, that can still supplement the consultants work with the recovery office. We could, again, I think to Mr. Roman's point, it actually could speed things up in the long run.
We will return to this at the next meeting. I want to keep us moving. So, Secretary, I think we on the new proposed Spark structure slide?
I don't think so. Based
or-
on, what I would say is based on the whole of the conversation.
Let's just keep going.
I think so. I think we have a good place of what we want to do next to be able to come back to that, so.
Great. Okay. So let's move on to outstanding topics.
One more for me. There you go. So in your packet, again, this is the conversation that was a part of the proposals that were brought forward at the first Spark Committee. And so additional information was provided with the follow-up packets. And this is bringing this proposal. As you remember, there were a couple that we brought forward last time for that early consideration. This is the only one that's coming forward, coming back at this time. And it is for to be able to use 22 million of the CRF dollars. And remember, the CRF dollars, this is the first round. This is not the ARPA dollars. This is the money that was recovered from our need not to pay for the state's percentage of the FEMA eligible expenses. And remember, this particular dollars has a clock on it that is different than ARPA. So these will expire at the end of 2021. And just again, there's the CRF dollars did have a little bit of a tighter eligibility or allowability space, and they really do have to be able to demonstrate a direct nexus to COVID. And so they were a little bit more restricted than as we start to talk about the ARPA dollars, just as a reminder of the different pot. The request was for $22 million to continue to use for UI surge support and IT support for UI. And I believe that Deputy Secretary Peter Brady is here. There he is. I see his nod. And he is here, and will welcome any questions or conversation in and around this particular proposal.
Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have questions, if that's allowable, because I feel like I'm still in this little bit of an ambiguous cloud. So the call center surge, is that the Accenture contract? Is that basically what that is, or is there, what else is around that? And what are our contract obligation, and what was it? We kind of sole sourced, there was a sole source for that. Is that what this is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. President.
And so what is that contract, and what's the contract rate? And
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President. So what is being proposed here would be a continuation of our current state. Specifically on surge resources, that tends to be about 600 resources on the phones. And when I say on the phones, I'm speaking pretty broadly. That's not just necessarily answering incoming phone calls, it's performing outbound work, it's ID verification for fraud-related issues. Generally, anything that is servicing Kansans that need assistance getting from where they are today to receiving benefits they may be owed. That is all through Accenture. That contract was signed in July of 2020. Committee, I was not here at that time, so I'm speaking from what's been briefed to me. It was an emergency bidding event. My understanding is there were 3 firms that were interested. Accenture was chosen because they had the ability to hit the ground quickly, and they had the depth of scope to do what was needed at the time. What we do today with Accenture is primarily, personnel, people on the phones, answering questions, assisting claimants, some IT supplemental support, right? At the time in July, the situation required us to do a full evaluation of the current systems and processes and review that to improve it so we could move forward. So that was why Accenture was chosen at that time. I don't know, Secretary, if you have anything else to add to.
how much was that contract for? And it ended June 30? Or
So the initial contract, I don't recall the term of it. It's been extended through amendments several times as we've needed it. One of the questions I think came up last time was the agency received $30 million in, I believe, September to help fund UI surge issues. And just to kind of brief the committee, so for total call center surge from July to present, the agency spent about $35.5 million. And then for IT supplemental support, that number is $3.7 million. So you'll see that incorporates the 30 million is covered by that. There's additional funds we have received from USDOL above our admin base that have also helped to fund that to date. In terms of the cost of the contract, so that's kind of the historical, the rate on resources is $48 per hour per resource.
I guess what I'm trying to straighten out in my head, was there, the reason this is requested is now we have July billing that was not contemplated in a prior KDOL budget, and so we're needing to move resources to cover that contract obligation for July, August, September?
Yeah, so, Mr. President, that's a good point. So where we are today, we are covered. If additional funding is not identified, we'll have to start rolling off resources relatively quickly. So there's not a unfunded portion at this point in time. However, we're getting closer to the point where if additional funds aren't made available, we'll have to start rolling down those resources pretty significantly. The goal and intent here is to have the current level of resources available for a longer period of time. The estimation I provided was that if we kept the current state with this $22 million, that would get us to the end of October. The caveat I'm going to add to that is we anticipate starting to roll down resources, especially as we hit August and September. The federal programs go away. It becomes a lot less of daily service to claimants and much more cleaning it up, getting everything in order, ultimately making sure we're prepared to modernize the system as we work towards that. So the intent here would be that, $22 million today gets us to at least the end of October. As we roll off resources, we spend less and less each month. And we really think that that could possibly get us to November, December, close out the calendar year, and really get us through all of the federal programs.
I guess then my follow-up question, kind of in the vein of what we ended up doing at our last meeting where we allowed for a continuation of recovery's budget. What would it take you then, what do you understand your number to be to take you through the end of August?
So through the end of August, it'd be split down the middle. It's 2 months instead of 4, so I'd say about 11.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you. I just want to clarify something the Secretary said. I think we're on the same page here. These are leftover from the CRF funds, money that wasn't spent, but could also be reappropriated back. Last year, State Finance Council had provision. We actually presented numerous times that any money could go to the UI Trust Fund. A couple times it was vetoed. Last time it was actually successful. I think it might have been a November meeting. At the time, I think we thought the funds had to be spent by the end of that fiscal year, or not fiscal year, but that calendar year. And then the guidance came to the end of 2021. That's still the case, though. If this money's not spent there, it could go directly to the Unemployment Trust Fund. For example, the $250 million that could have went anywhere within guidelines that we just put in for the fraud, there's another $250 that may come. This could be part of that, and so we could reduce that. So this money it's not in a vacuum. Like I said, when you're saying yes to this, you're saying no to either other spending that we could free up to do use other projects we spent the first hour discussing, or it can go directly to the UI Trust Fund in addition to the 500. There's a lot of, so the questions that the President's asked and someone we asked about the necessity of this money, it's not only one, there's only not just one option for this money. There's multiple options for this money. And one of the frustrations that we've had, especially in the legislature, is numerous times we asked about the details of that contract. And we're just now getting them. We just now found out there was 2 of the bids. We're just finding out the rates. And so that's why they have these questions. I just want to clarify that this money is not all or nothing. It goes away. It goes back. It doesn't go back to the federal government. If we don't spend it, it directly goes wherever this body wants. But right now, without our action, it would go to the UI Trust Fund.
Mr. Orman? I'm sorry, Ms.
Go ahead. Just a point of clarification. So you've spent $30 million in consulting services for the first 12 months, from July of last year to June of this year, and you're asking for 20+ million for the next 4 months. Is that right?
Sorry, I can restate those numbers. It was 39.2 million total from July of last year until today. The important caveat I'd add is that we needed more resources, and they really didn't surge up substantially until we got to about the March, April timeframe, where we made a significant resource investment, which really started to turn the tide on many of the issues that we saw. So part of the reason that might not be apples to apples is because when we started in July, August, September of last year, we didn't have as many resources as we have today.
Can you give me an update on what is the status of the backlog and the problems the department was having?
Yeah, thank you. So just to give a high-level overview, and we've been working with the UI Modernization Council that's created by House Bill 2196. We've talked through this pretty extensively in the first two sets of 2-day meetings, excuse me. So anybody who's interested in that, I'd encourage you to look at the materials from those meetings. But generally speaking, we're in a much better place than we were, particularly in the February, March, April timeframe. As of now, 60 to 80% of calls get answered. Unique callers get answered on an average day. On good days, that's 90 and plus. That's not exactly where I want to land. I want to be at 100%. With the volumes we face, that's just challenging. Another great provision of House Bill 2196, it gave us the ability to work with local law enforcement offices to help individuals that may have a fraud issue on their claim. That has allowed us, along with other surge resources and ID verification, to get through all of the claimants that may have been victimized by identity theft at one point and need that fraud flag addressed so they can get access to the benefits they're entitled to. Generally speaking, when we were at August and testifying in front of legislative committees, the adjudications backlog was 25,000 plus issues that were not being timely addressed. Now, most adjudications issues are addressed within USDOL's 21-day time period. With all of that being said, we're in a better place. There's still just a large volume of work to do. because we know that with the surge of claims that we had, everything else in the agency sees an increase in what needs to be done and what we need to do. A good example of that, I talked about how many adjudications we had because we just, in normal times, Kansas was seeing 1,500-ish new claims per week. The first week of the pandemic, we saw 50,000. So the increase, and it's been talked about a lot, but the downstream effects of that are substantial. So we saw a huge issue in adjudications because we just had so many more issues to adjudicate than we had staff that were trained to do them at that time. So we had to get folks in the door, folks trained up. What we see now is, individuals that may have been denied benefits have a right to file an appeal. So individuals are filing appeals. We have to keep up with that workload. We also have to keep in mind that with a record number of individuals filing for unemployment benefits, we have to spend a lot of time and resources ensuring that the tax information that's sent to employers on individuals that may or may not have claimed from that employer is accurate and that the employer is charged what is fair and what is right under the law. So on the claimant side of things, things are substantially better. We're still working through them. That also means that there's still a lot of downstream work we're trying to get through to make sure that, like I said, employers are treated fairly, claimants' issues get cleaned up, and we can ultimately close out these federal programs and modernize the system.
Mr. Orman?
Do these resources actually help you with the downstream issues if they're primarily on the phone?
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Orman. That's a good question. I'd say yes. The challenge, and I did a presentation on this on Tuesday for the Modernization Council. The biggest challenge is getting resources in the door that can be trained on a mainframe technology that was first developed in 1978. It is a black screen with green text that's just very challenging to navigate. When we get someone trained through what we call initial intake training, they get the broad training on our mainframe system, how to look at the information, how to process and file claims. That kind of core training applies to everything else in the agency. So in pre-pandemic times, we'd always say that starting in the call center was a great path to move up in the agency somewhere else. Because if you have that core knowledge base, you can do adjudications, you can process different issues for UI tax, all of that kind of stuff. So for our surge resources, as the needs on the phone have been less, we've shifted them into other areas where we know there's large workloads that just need people and bodies to work through them. So as long as we have the group we have that has that core training, we can utilize them for those functions.
Mr. President?
Thank you. So just I'm walking through my math. If I got 600 people and they're working 40 hours a week and our contract rate's $48 an hour, so 1.1 million, 1.1215 million a week, 8 weeks, I'm 9.2 million. Takes me to the end of August. So would you be, I would be more inclined to suggest we approve $9.2 million today.
So, Mr. President, if I could just quickly, I'll say the 600 number is what I'm generally quoting. That number goes up and down a little bit. Working in a contact center for unemployment is a pretty challenging job. So we do see a turnover rate both on our resources and our surge resources. We're also always training and bringing new folks in. The other component to that, which I think may be on the slide, is in addition to the surge resources we have on the phone, we also have supplemental IT resources. Mostly developers, mainframe developers, which are brutally challenging to find, and others who keep the technology system up and running. What I'll say to that too is, and some of you may recall that were involved in this issue last year, we were having weekly severity 1 level incidents with the mainframe technology with other systems that administer unemployment. Those are much fewer and far between now because of what we've been able to put in the system. But another portion of that money, which I think is outlined, is we have contracted mainframe developers who know how to program in COBOL VSAM, a language that I don't think has been taught for 15, 20 years in universities, if I had to guess. So splitting it at the 11, I think, gets to both the surge resources that we anticipate needing and utilizing, but also keeping the contracted IT staff around that can keep the system up and running and make sure claimants have access to it.
I'd just say that we've come a very long way at the Department of Labor. We're not out of the woods. We can't step away from these services now without a negative impact on on claimants and on Kansas businesses. You're saying it'd be about $11 million to get us through to the end of August. Is that correct, Deputy Secretary?
That is correct.
I'll be willing to move you approve 11, and then we have a new report in August.
We have a motion. Is there a second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Discussion?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not a master of parliamentary procedure. Mr. Speaker.
My question is, I know a lot of this is driven by the stuff coming from the feds, and I know, plus we're trying to talk about being there to help businesses. Both the House and Senate passed a resolution that says the $300 additional federal money should not be included. Continuing that process, what does that add into the cost? If this was to go away today, what would it cost to extend us to August?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say it'd be marginal. At the end of the day, kind of what I talked to, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now are a little more downstream. So it's, in other words, I think to get to your question, Mr. Speaker, you're kind of getting at if some of those programs were to end now as opposed to the September 4th deadline, what is the additional operational expense for administering those? Those, generally speaking, are claimants who have their issues abated, are receiving their payments regularly. The issues we're working on now are claimants that, we're having to clean up, we're having to file back weeks for, we're having to take care of some fraud type issue that's flagged on their account. Whether or not the federal programs exist doesn't change a lot of that body of work. There's probably a marginal amount to your point, Mr. Speaker, but I'd say generally speaking, a lot of what we have in front of us, and to the Lieutenant Governor's point, to get out of the woods is not directly related to that.
Additional discussion? Okay. We have a motion and a second. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Okay, thank you. All right, Secretary Burns-Wallace.
I think that we had good discussion. We have some additional next steps to follow up with, as well as outreach to the committee. I will say that just knowing, again, that we're still in summer and many people have travel plans, we'll need to reach out to see in the next couple of weeks what availability looks like of the committee so that we can pull this group back together. So please, as the Recovery Office reaches out, let them know who to work with to know your availability so that we can get the information back to you, but also keep the conversations moving.
Okay. Terrific. I want to thank the members of the committee. We've had an open and candid and I think productive conversation. So thank you. I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you.